The morning Effie Wainwright rode into the town of Caldera Flats, New Mexico Territory, the summer of 1882. She did so on a horse that wasn't hers, wearing boots that didn't fit, and carrying a letter of introduction that she suspected wouldn't be worth the paper it was written on. She had ridden hard from Santa Fe, stopping only twice to water her borrowed mare, and once to eat a cold biscuit she had wrapped in a handkerchief 3 days prior. The biscuit had not improved with time, but hunger has a way of softening a person's standards. Effie ate it without complaint, brushed the crumbs from her canvas riding skirt, and pressed on south toward a job she had not yet been officially offered, and a ranch she had only heard described in second-hand terms by a woman at a boarding house who had said, with the gravity of someone delivering biblical prophecy, "The Walker Ranch will either make you or break you, honey. There's no in-between out there." Effie was 24 years old. She had spent the last 5 of those years working with horses in one capacity or another. First at her uncle's modest stable in Albuquerque, where she had learned to recognize the language horses speak with their ears and their eyes, and the particular way they shift their weight when they are deciding whether to trust you. Then, after her uncle sold the stable and moved to Colorado for reasons she never fully understood, she had hired herself out as a hand at various operations across the territory, each one slightly larger than the last, each one requiring her to prove herself all over again because she was a woman and women were not, in the prevailing wisdom of 1882 New Mexico, supposed to know the things she knew about horses. She had broken 11 horses in the last 2 years. 11 horses that other handlers had given up on, animals branded difficult or dangerous or beyond saving. She had not broken a single one of them with a whip or a harsh bit or the kind of cruel force that some men called training. She had done it the way her uncle had taught her, the way his father had taught him, by learning the animal first, by understanding what it feared and what it needed, and what it was capable of when given half a chance to show its better nature. The reputation had followed her, as reputations do in the thinly populated stretches of the New Mexico Territory, traveling faster than the mail and arriving with considerably more embellishment. By the time she reached Caldera Flats and tied her borrowed mare to the hitching post outside the general store to ask directions to the Walker Ranch, she had reportedly broken 30 horses, ridden a stallion that had killed 2 men, and performed feats of horsemanship that suggested a supernatural arrangement of some kind. None of that was precisely true, but Effie had learned that attempting to correct a legend rarely achieved anything useful. The man behind the counter at the general store, a round-faced fellow named Dawes with spectacles that sat perpetually crooked on his nose, gave her directions to the Walker Ranch with a look of faint concern. "You got business out there?" he asked, not impolitely. "I hope to," Effie said. "Joseph Walker's a fair man," Dawes said, and then paused in the way people pause when there is a qualifier coming that they are deciding whether to voice. "He can be a hard man, too. Not cruel, mind you, just particular about how things are done, and he doesn't take well to people claiming they can do things they can't." "I can do what I say I can do," Effie said. Dawes looked at her for a moment, then nodded in a way that suggested he believed her but wasn't sure the world at large would agree. 6 miles south on the main road, then east at the big rock that looks like a sitting dog. You'll see the gate after that. Can't miss it. She found the rock easily enough. It did look like a sitting dog, or perhaps a very large, patient man. She turned east and found the gate and rode through it onto Walker land, and the land itself was something that made her slow her mare to a walk purely so she could look at it properly. The ranch spread across a wide valley ringed by low hills, the kind of hills that in the afternoon light turned the color of old copper and rust. The grass was good, not lush the way eastern grass is, but the sturdy, honest grass of the high desert that knows how to nourish things without making a show of it. There were cattle on the distant slopes and horses in a pen near the main barn, and the barn itself was a substantial building, weathered silver gray, standing solid against the blue sky like something that intended to be standing there long after everyone currently alive was not. A ranch house sat back from the barn, 2 stories, with a covered porch that wrapped around the front and the south side. Smoke came from the chimney in a thin, domestic thread. There were outbuildings scattered with practical purpose: a bunkhouse, a smaller stable, a smokehouse, a chicken coop that currently had 4 or 5 chickens standing on its roof for reasons that chickens alone could explain. Effie rode to the barn and dismounted and was standing there with her reins in her hand when she first heard him. The laugh came from around the side of the barn, a rich, genuine sound, the laugh of a man who finds something actually funny rather than the performed kind of laughter people use in company. She walked toward the sound and came around the corner of the barn to find 3 men standing near the fence of the horse pen, watching a 4th man, clearly a ranch hand, attempting to approach a dark gray horse that kept retreating to the far end of the pen with theatrical disgust. The man who had laughed was leaning on the top fence rail with his forearms, watching the proceedings with what appeared to be a combination of amusement and resignation. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dusty brown hat that had seen considerable weather, and he had the kind of face that New Mexico territory has a way of producing in men who spend most of their lives outdoors, tanned and lean, and carrying a few lines around the eyes that were as much from squinting at the horizon as from age. He looked to be somewhere in his early 30s, maybe 32, maybe 33. His dark hair curled slightly at the edges where it escaped from beneath the hat, and his hands on the fence rail were the hands of a working man, strong and capable with a few old scars across the knuckles. He had not noticed her yet. She watched him watch the horse for a moment, and she could already tell from where she was standing that the horse in the pen was not a mean animal. It was a frightened one. There is a difference that most people who are not listening carefully enough tend to miss. She tied her mare to the fence post nearby and walked to where the men were gathered. "Joseph Walker," she said. The tall man turned from the fence and looked at her, and she had the immediate distinct impression of dark eyes that missed very little. He straightened from his lean and turned to face her fully, and even the simple courtesy of that full attention told her something about the kind of man he was. "That's me," he said. "Can I help you?" "I'm Effie Wainwright," she said. "I wrote to you about the position, the horse work." Something shifted in his expression, a slight recalibration, the look of a man whose mental picture of a situation has just encountered reality and found a significant discrepancy. He had expected, she could see very plainly, a man. They always expected a man. "Miss Wainwright," he said, and his voice was even, giving nothing away. "I got your letter. I'll admit I assumed that I was a man," she said. "I know. I didn't specify because I've found it leads to conversations I'd rather not have before I've had a chance to demonstrate what I can do." One of the other men near the fence, a young fellow with a sunburned neck and an expression of frank astonishment, made a small sound. The man next to him, older, with a gray-streaked mustache, kept his face deliberately neutral in the way of a man who has learned to watch which way the wind blows before committing to an expression. Joseph Walker studied her for a moment. Then, with the deliberateness of a man choosing his words, he said, "The position is for someone who can work the green horses, the ones that need handling before they can be put to proper use. We've got 4 right now that are giving us trouble, including that gray in the pen there." "I can see that," Effie said. "I'm not in the habit of doubting people on sight," Joseph said, and she heard in that sentence the careful, honest thing he was trying to say, that he would give her the benefit of what his eyes had not yet confirmed. "But I'd be lying if I said this was a situation I've encountered before, a woman applying to break horses." "I imagine it's not," she said. "Can you do it?" He asked, and there was nothing condescending in the question. It was simply a question, the same one he would have asked any applicant standing before him. It was the directness of a man who valued time and honest answers over pleasantries. "Yes," she said, "I can do it." He looked at her for another moment, and then, With the particular comedy of bad timing, the gray horse in the pen chose that moment to rear magnificently, dumping the ranch hand who had finally gotten close enough onto the dirt, and galloped to the opposite end of the enclosure with its tail flagged high. Joseph Walker did not look at the horse. He kept his eyes on Effie. And then slowly, a smile broke across his face, and then the laugh came again, that rich, genuine sound, but this time she could hear that it was not entirely at her expense. There was something almost fond in it, as if the situation had struck him as absurd in a way he was willing to be charmed by. "All right, Miss Wainwright," he said, when the laugh had settled. "Show me what you can do with that gray and we'll talk about the position." She did not hesitate. She handed her borrowed mare's reins to the nearest ranch hand, the young one with the sunburned neck who took them with the automatic reflexes of someone whose hands act before his brain catches up, and she walked to the gate of the pen and let herself in. She did not go directly to the horse. This was the first and most important thing, the thing that most people who were in too much of a hurry to listen always got wrong. She went to the middle of the pen and stood there, and she waited. The gray horse watched her from the far end. It was a stallion, about 3 years old by her estimate, dark steel gray with a black mane and a white star on his forehead. Beautiful and miserable and frightened in equal measure. She could see from the way he held his neck and the tightness around his eye that he had been pushed too hard and too fast by people who did not know how to read the signals he had been sending out quite clearly. She stood in the middle of the pen and she breathed, and she let the horse look at her, and she looked back at him without the fixed, predatory stare that horses interpret as threat. She let her gaze soften and drift slightly, the body language of an animal that means no harm, and she held her hands loose at her sides. At the fence she could feel the weight of 4 men watching her, could feel the particular quality of Joseph Walker's attention among them, something steady and patient and genuinely curious rather than dismissive. The gray horse's ears, which had been pinned flat, moved. One came forward, a small thing but a beginning. She took 1 step toward him. He shifted his weight but did not retreat. She stopped and waited again. The second ear came forward. She took another step, stopped, waited. The horse lowered his head by perhaps 2 inches, the minimum possible concession, but she honored it as though it were a formal agreement, standing still and quiet while he considered his options. It took 11 minutes. She was not watching the time, but she learned afterward from the gray-mustached ranch hand, whose name was Cord Hensley and who would become one of her genuine friends in the months ahead, that he had counted because he had nothing else to do with his hands while he watched, and counting felt like a useful occupation. At 11 minutes, the gray horse walked to her. He did not rush. He walked with the dignity of an animal that is choosing to do this rather than being compelled, and that was the whole difference in the world. He stretched his neck and breathed warm air against her outstretched hand, and she let him, and then she very slowly raised her hand and laid it against the side of his neck, and he stood for it. Behind her, from the fence, she heard a low, long exhale from one of the men. She could not have said with certainty which one it was, but later she would suspect it had been Joseph Walker. She worked with the gray horse for another 30 minutes, not attempting to do everything in one session, not trying to impress anyone with speed. She simply built on what had been established, moving along his side, getting him accustomed to the weight of her hand on his neck and shoulder and flank, letting him understand that she had no intention of hurting him. When she finally let herself out of the pen, the gray horse stood at the center of the enclosure watching her go, and his ears were forward and his head was low, and every line of his body said something different from what it had said when she walked in. She came back through the gate and found Joseph Walker standing there waiting for her. The other men had drawn back somewhat, as if by instinct, leaving a space between her and Joseph that felt somehow private. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on a man's face in quite this context before. It was not merely professional assessment, though it was partly that. There was something under it, a quality of attention that she recognized as the beginning of genuine interest, the kind that has nothing to do with a job and everything to do with the person standing in front of you. "It's 9:15, he said. She looked at him, not understanding immediately. "You came in on this land at about 8:30, he said. "It's 9:15 now." "I know," she said. "I didn't want to rush him. He's got a good mind. He just needs time. What can you do with him by noon?" Joseph asked. She looked back at the gray horse who was now standing at the fence nearest them, watching. She felt the shape of the question and understood it was not merely about the horse. "By noon," she said, "he'll take a saddle blanket." Joseph Walker looked at the horse and then back at her, and the expression on his face had completed some kind of internal calculation. "You've got the position, Miss Wainwright," he said, "if you want it." "I want it," she said. "Pay is $12 a month, same as my other hands," he said. "Board and meals included. I won't pay you less because you're a woman, and I won't pay you more because of some novelty value. Same work, same pay." "That's fair," she said. "There's a room in the house," he said. "I'll have Martha, that's the woman who cooks and keeps the house for me, fix it up proper. The bunkhouse is for the ranch hands and it wouldn't be appropriate for you to—" "I understand," she said. "I appreciate it." He nodded. Then he said, somewhat abruptly, as if the words had come up on him from an unexpected direction, "I laughed when you said you could break horses. When you first said it, before I saw what you could do. I want you to know that." "I noticed," she said. "I'm not laughing now," he said. "No," she said, "you're not." They looked at each other for a moment that was just slightly longer than purely professional, and then Joseph Walker cleared his throat and glanced toward the house. "Martha will show you your room and you can get yourself settled. When you're ready, come back out and we'll talk about the other 3 horses and what you think they need." "I'd like to see them now, actually," she said. "Before I settle. I want to look at them while I'm fresh." He looked at her again with that quality of attention, and then the corner of his mouth moved upward in something that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood. "All right," he said. "Come on, then." Martha Gaines turned out to be a stout woman in her 50s with gray hair braided and pinned, and an expression that was simultaneously welcoming and assessing. The face of a woman who had run a household long enough to have developed reliable instincts about character. She brought Effie a tin cup of coffee and a plate of cornbread, while Effie was still standing at the fence of the secondary enclosure looking at 3 horses, and the gesture itself was the equivalent of a formal declaration of acceptance. "You eat while you look," Martha said. "No point in going hungry while you're being clever." Effie ate and looked, and what she saw was 3 horses at various stages of fear and confusion and unhappy experience. A bay gelding who pinned his ears and showed the whites of his eyes. A young sorrel mare who had clearly been spooked badly at some point and never quite recovered her nerve. And an older black horse, a gelding, who stood apart from the other 2 with an expression of weary resignation that suggested he had tried to communicate his objections through every available channel and had given up. She was still standing there when Joseph came back from wherever he had gone, and she heard his boots on the dry ground before she saw him, a comfortable, unhurried sound. "Do you think," he asked, coming to stand beside her at the fence, "the bay needs the same thing the gray needs mostly? He's been pushed. He needs someone to slow down and listen to him." She nodded toward the sorrel. "She's been frightened. I'll need to know what happened." "She threw a rider last spring and he came off bad," Joseph said straightforwardly. "Broke his arm. After that, 3 different men tried to get her back under saddle and each time ended badly. She's fast and she's smart and she's scared." "What happened to the rider?" He heeled up. "He's working over at the Morrison spread now." Joseph paused. "He was rough with her before the throw. I didn't know it at the time. I found out after." The fact that he told her this without being asked for it, the frank disclosure of something that reflected poorly on his previous management, told her something about him. It told her he valued accuracy over his own dignity, which was a rare enough quality that she registered it. "And the black," she said. "That's Cricket," Joseph said, and his voice changed very slightly when he said the horse's name, softened by something that was not quite sentimentality but was close to it. "He's mine, or he was." He's 9 years old and he was the best horse I've ever owned, and he went lame 2 winters ago and I rested him and treated him and he came back sound, but his spirit, he stopped. She waited. He came back different. Something went out of him during those months. He doesn't fight you, but he doesn't give you anything either. It's like riding something that has decided it doesn't care anymore. She looked at Cricket, the black horse standing alone at the back of the enclosure, and she felt the particular ache that comes from recognizing a kind of grief you understand. "I'll try with him," she said. "I can't promise what I can with the others because what he needs is different. But I'll try." "That's all I'd ask," Joseph said. The first week passed in the way that first weeks do, in a blur of learning the rhythms and language of a new place. The Walker Ranch ran 160 cattle and kept 12 working horses and employed 5 men full-time, Cord Hensley and 4 others, Davy, who was 19 and eager, Pete, who was 27 and methodical, Frank, who was 40-something and spoke sparingly, and a young man named Roberto, whose family had ranched this land before it was American territory, and who knew things about the grass and the water and the weather that no one else on the ranch possessed. There was a tension in that knowledge being undervalued that Effie noticed, and that she could see Joseph was at least partially aware of and working to address, paying Roberto fairly and listening when he spoke, even when the others were slower to do so. She made progress with the gray, whose name turned out to be Ghost, a name chosen by Davy and accepted by general consensus. By the end of the first day she had him accepting the blanket as promised. By the third day she had him standing for the saddle. By the 6th day she rode him for the first time a walk around the pen, and Ghost moved beneath her with such concentrated dignity, such deliberate cooperation, that she felt the peculiar emotion that comes from an animal choosing to trust you fully. She worked on the bay in parallel. He was less subtle than Ghost, his fears more straightforward and therefore in some ways easier to address. He wanted to know he was safe. She showed him that he was, consistently, over and over, and by day 4 he was following her around the pen like a large, bony dog. The sorrel mare was harder. Her fear was deep in her somewhere, and coaxing it out required patience of a particular and sustained kind. Effie worked with her every morning before the heat settled in, moving slowly, speaking quietly, letting the mare dictate the pace of every step. There were setbacks. A sudden noise from the direction of the bunkhouse that sent the mare into the fence with a crash that left Effie's heart in her throat. A day when nothing worked at all, and Effie walked away from the pen after 2 hours having gained nothing new. She did not let herself show frustration at the mare. She took her frustration out for a long walk behind the barn where no one could see it, and then she came back and she tried a different approach. Cricket was the most complex. She spent time with him every day simply sitting in the pen near where he stood, not asking anything of him, just being present. He would watch her and then stop watching her and stand with his eyes half closed, and she couldn't always tell if she was making progress or simply providing entertainment for a horse who had retreated so far inside himself that no approach could reach him. Joseph came and watched her work, not every day and not intrusively, but often enough that she became aware of his watching as a kind of constant in the days, the way you become aware of a sound that is always present until it becomes part of the texture of where you are. He rarely interrupted. He asked questions in the evening sometimes when the work was done and they would both find themselves on the porch of the ranch house in the cooling air, Martha having gone in and the rest of the ranch settling into the quiet sounds of night. "How do you know when a horse is ready?" he asked on the 4th evening. "The same way you know when a person is ready for something," she said. "They stop performing. They stop pretending. They just are." He considered that for a while, sitting with his forearms on his knees and his hat on the porch rail beside him. His hair, without the hat, curled more decisively. She had noticed this and filed it away in the category of things she was noticing about Joseph Walker, which was becoming a longer list than she had anticipated. "Where did you learn it?" he asked. "The way you work with them." She told him about her uncle, about the stable in Albuquerque, about the years of hired work across the territory. She told him about the 11 horses, and he listened without the skepticism that some men put on like armor at the first sign of someone knowing something they don't, or knowing it better. "My father couldn't do anything with horses that weren't willing," he said when she had finished. "He was a good man in most respects. But with horses he thought effort and insistence were the same as skill." He paused. He wasn't wrong about much, but he was wrong about that. "A lot of people are," she said, without any judgment in it. "He built this ranch," Joseph said, and she heard in his voice the complicated mixture of love and grief and the unresolved weight of a legacy that sits on you whether you want it to or not. "He and my mother. My mother died when I was 12. My father 7 years ago. It's mine now, which means everything he built it's a responsibility I take seriously." "I can see that," she said, and she could. Everything about the Walker Ranch, the maintenance of the fences, the condition of the horses and cattle, the fairness with which he treated his hands, the particular quality of attention he paid to everything within his care, spoke of a man who understood that stewardship was not ownership, that to have something in your charge meant you owed it something. "Do you have family?" he asked. "Back in Santa Fe, was it?" "Santa Fe most recently," she said. "My parents are both gone. My father went when I was 9, fever. My mother remarried, and the man she married didn't have much use for a stepdaughter who preferred horses to domestic arrangements. We came to an understanding about that when I was 18 and I left." "Left to where?" he asked, and the question was careful, not prying but genuinely interested in the fact of who she was. "Wherever there was work," she said, which was usually wherever there were horses that needed someone to listen to them. He nodded slowly. "You're not afraid of being unsettled?" "I've been unsettled for 6 years," she said. "You get used to it, or you get comfortable with it." She paused. "I'm not sure those are the same thing either." He looked at her then, fully, in the way he sometimes did that made her feel very plainly seen, and she returned the look with equal directness, because she had never found much use in looking away from things. The evening air had cooled the way New Mexico evenings do, dropping fast after sunset, and there were stars beginning to appear in the south. Somewhere out toward the horse pen, Cricket made a low sound, the first voluntary sound she had heard from him, and both of them turned their heads slightly toward it and then turned back. "It's good to have you here," Joseph said, and the simplicity of it, the complete absence of complication in the way he said it, was more affecting than any elaborate thing might have been. "It's good to be here," she said, and meant it. The second week brought a problem in the form of a man named Harlan Cross, who ran a competing cattle operation about 12 miles to the west and had an interest in acquiring a parcel of water rights that happened to border Walker land. He rode in one morning while Effie was working with the sorrel mare, accompanied by 2 of his own hands, and went into the ranch house to speak with Joseph, and came out 20 minutes later looking the way men look when a conversation has not gone the way they expected. He noticed Effie on his way out, or rather he noticed the situation in the horse pen, and he stopped. "That the woman horsebreaker I heard about in town?" he asked, addressing no one in particular, or perhaps addressing his own men who had stopped behind him. Joseph had come out onto the porch after him and stood there watching. Cord Hensley, who had been patching fence nearby, had gone still in the way people do when they are paying careful attention. Effie kept working with the mare, who had been making progress and whose attention she did not want to lose. She did not look over at Harlan Cross. "That's Miss Wainwright," Joseph said from the porch, and his voice was perfectly level but had developed the particular flatness of a man who is containing something. "She works for me." "Breaking horses," Harlan Cross said, and she could hear the quality of the amusement in it, the kind that is not actually finding something funny but using laughter as a smaller version of contempt. "Isn't that something?" The sorrel mare flicked her ears at the sound of his voice, her nervousness spiking perceptibly. Effie moved to block the mare's sightline to the men, a small lateral shift that redirected the horse's attention back to her. "You've concluded your business, Harlan," Joseph said. Safe ride back. There was a pause, and then the sound of horses moving away, and then Cord Hensley exhaled loudly enough to be heard from where he was standing. "Sorry about that," Joseph said, coming to the fence after the visitors had cleared the gate. "You don't have anything to apologize for," Effie said. "My land, my guests, my responsibility," he said simply, "even when the guest is not one I chose." She looked at him over the fence, this man who kept taking responsibility for things honestly and without theatrics, and she felt something shift in her chest in a way that was beginning to be familiar but had not yet been named. "The mare barely flinched," she said instead, because naming the thing she felt in her chest seemed premature and also possibly terrifying. A week ago that kind of disruption would have sent her into the fence. She's trusting her own reactions more now. Joseph looked at the sorrel mare with the expression he had been developing in his observations, the look of a man learning to see what someone else is seeing. "She does look steadier," he said. "She's going to be all right," Effie said. "I believe you," he said, and the thing about it was that he said it as if believing her was the most natural thing in the world, as if it had never occurred to him to do otherwise, which was different from every other situation she had been in and affected her more than she wanted to immediately acknowledge. On the 10th day, she rode the sorrel mare. It was not long, and it was not fast, and she did not push anything beyond what the animal was ready for. But the mare walked, and then trotted at her lightest urging around the pen 3 times, and when Effie brought her to a stop and slid down and stood there with the mare breathing warmly at her shoulder, she felt the particular fullness of something important accomplished. Joseph was at the fence. He had come out when she mounted, and he had watched the whole thing without a word, standing with his hands in his pockets and his hat pushed back on his head. "That's something to see," he said, when she came through the gate. "She's not finished," Effie said. "She'll need more time before she's ready to work, but she's over the worst of it." "Thanks to you," he said. "Thanks to her," Effie said. "She decided she was ready. I just showed up consistently enough that she believed I would keep showing up." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with a deliberateness that suggested the words had been considered before being spoken, "That seems like a quality that has uses beyond horses." She met his eyes, and there it was, that thing between them that had been building in the evening conversations and the shared silences and the way he listened, and the way she felt seen by his listening. It was right there on the surface now, clear as the blue sky above the Caldera Flats. She didn't say anything immediately. Neither did he. But something had been acknowledged. An acknowledgement once given changes the landscape permanently. That evening at supper, with Martha and Cord and Davy all eating at the long kitchen table, the conversation went to the upcoming county fair in the fall, and whether Walker horses would be shown. And Davy said with the enthusiasm of someone 19 who finds all enthusiasm appropriate, that if Miss Wainwright was going to be there, they ought to put Ghost in the exhibition because it would be something worth seeing. "Is that right?" Martha said, in the voice of a woman who was watching something with great personal interest. "Ghost is going to be ready for the exhibition," Effie said, "if we keep at it." "Then you should stay through the fall," Cord said, with the simplicity of a man who does not see why this is complicated. "She's hired through to whenever the work is done," Joseph said, and his voice was careful in a way that had not been there a week ago. Martha caught Effie's eye across the table and said nothing, which is sometimes the most eloquent form of communication available. On the 14th day, Cricket followed her. It was the smallest possible thing, a step and then another, the black horse moving from his preferred corner at the back of the pen to a position approximately 10 feet behind where she stood. She did not make a production of it. She simply stood where she was and let him make the choice and felt the quiet joy of it moving through her like water. She told Joseph that evening. "He moved toward me," she said. He followed, a little. Joseph set down the coffee cup he was holding and stared at her. "Cricket followed you." "About 10 feet, she said. "It's a small thing." "It's not a small thing," he said, with a feeling in his voice that surprised her with its depth. "I've had 3 men try with him. He hasn't taken a step toward anyone in 2 years." He stopped. 2 years. She watched him process this, watched something happen in his face that was private and important, the internal rearrangement of hope that had been put away. "I can't promise where it goes from there," she said. "I'll keep working with him and we'll see what he can give." "I know," he said. "I trust your judgment." Then he said, "I should tell you something. Before you came here, I was getting ready to sell him. Not because I wanted to. Because it seemed kinder, maybe, than keeping him here in that state. Like he was waiting for something that wasn't going to come." "He was waiting," she said, "just for the right thing." They were both quiet for a while, and the stars were thick in the dark sky above the valley, and somewhere out beyond the house Cricket was standing in the pen in the New Mexico night, and he had moved 10 feet toward her, and that was real, and that was enough. "Miss Wainwright," Joseph said, and then stopped and then started again. "Effie." It was the first time he had used her given name, and she felt it the way you feel the first warm day after a long cold stretch with all of your skin at once. "Yes," she said. "I would like you to stay," he said. "Beyond the horses, beyond the season. I would like—" He stopped again, and she watched him navigate the difficulty of saying something true and important without the armor of easy language. "I find that, when you're not here, the place feels less, and I don't know entirely what to do with that, but I thought you should know it." Effie sat with what he had said, and she could feel her own heart doing something complicated and warm behind her ribs, and she chose honesty in return because honesty is what he had given her, and it seemed the only appropriate currency. "I haven't wanted to stay anywhere in 6 years," she said. "I've been comfortable moving because nothing felt worth stopping for. And I find that—" She paused, finding her own words. "I find that I look for you in the morning when I come out of the house. I find that the things I notice through the day, I'm filing them away to tell you in the evenings. I find that this—" She gestured, a small inadequate gesture at the porch and the house and the ranch beyond it, "feels like somewhere I could stop." Joseph looked at her for a long moment in the starlight, and then he said quietly, "Then stay." "We should," she began, thinking of propriety and the complications of the situation. "I'm not asking anything improper," he said, and his voice was careful and sincere. I'm telling you that I intend to court you, Effie Wainwright, properly and honestly if you'll allow it, and that I'd like very much for you to consider whether this place and whether I might be worth considering." "You're asking me to consider you," she said. "I'm asking you to consider me," he confirmed, and there was something endearing and honest about the straightforwardness of it, no flourishes, no performance, just a man saying plainly what he meant. "I'm already considering you," she said. "I've been considering you for 2 weeks." His expression was worth looking at. She thought she might want to look at it for a very long time. The next several weeks wore the quality of something precious happening slowly, the way weather changes in the high desert, dramatically and completely, but with a process that you can watch if you know how to look. Joseph brought her wildflowers one morning, 3 stems of something purple that grew in the shade of the low hills, presented without ceremony, just laid on the fence post nearest where she was working and left there, and the simplicity of the gesture was more affecting than a formal bouquet might have been. She pressed one of the flowers between 2 pages of the small book she kept in her travel bag, a habit she had had since she was a girl. He took her riding one afternoon when the horses were settled and the heat was leveling off, out across the eastern part of the ranch where the land opened into a wide, shallow valley, with a creek running through it that in late summer still held a good foot of clear water. They rode side by side and talked, and the conversation moved through every territory that easy and honest conversation moves through, family and memory and opinion, and the kind of laughter that comes from 2 people finding the same things absurd. She learned things about him. He had been to school in Santa Fe as a boy, which had given him a love of books that he was slightly embarrassed about in the way that men in that time and place sometimes were. As if reading were a luxury, he had not quite earned the right to. He had a younger sister in Tucson named Clara who wrote to him twice a month and whose letters he kept in a box in his desk. He had been briefly engaged, 5 years ago, to a woman named Helen who had come west from Ohio, and discovered that she disliked New Mexico territory with a passion that outweighed her attachment to Joseph, and who had gone back east with his blessing and presumably some relief. He did not speak of this bitterly, but with the particular equanimity of someone who has sorted through a thing and arrived on the other side of it. "Were you heartbroken?" Effie asked, genuinely curious. "I was disappointed," he said, considering. "I think I was more heartbroken about it than she was at the time, but I've thought about it since, and I believe we were both trying to want something that we didn't actually want. That's a particular kind of foolishness that's easy to fall into when you think you're supposed to want certain things. Marriage and a settled life," she said. "Marriage and a settled life with the wrong person," he corrected, and looked at her sideways with those dark eyes. "Settled life with the right person sounds entirely different to me." "Does it?" she said. "You know it does," he said. She was learning his directness, the way he arrived at truth without meandering, and she found it matched something in herself, a shared intolerance for the elaborate avoidance of plain things. It made conversation feel like walking on solid ground. She told him about her mother's second husband, the stepfather who had not been unkind exactly but who had made it clear, with the fine instruments of daily indifference, that she was a complication in a life he had not planned on her being a part of. She told him about the loneliness of that arrangement and the determination she had come to at 18, that she would be self-sufficient or she would be nothing, that she would find her own worth in the world without waiting for someone to assign it to her. "And you found it," he said, "with the horses." "The horses don't care who your stepfather thinks you are," she said. "They only care who you actually are." "That's more than most people manage," he said. Cricket was her greatest preoccupation in those weeks, the slow, careful work of reaching a horse that had gone away from the world. She was patient with him in a way that required a particular kind of faith, the faith that the effort was worthwhile even without visible evidence. And then, gradually, evidence came. Cricket began to meet her at the fence of the pen in the mornings, not every morning, but enough mornings. He allowed her hands on him with increasing ease. He began to carry his head higher. Joseph watched this with an expression she had learned to read, a mixture of wonder and gratitude and something more personal that was about Cricket and about his father and about the version of himself that had been on the verge of giving up. On the 31st day, she put a saddle on Cricket. He stood for it with complete stillness, his ears forward, his eyes soft, and Joseph, who was watching from the fence, pressed his hand to his mouth for a moment and looked away toward the hills. She did not ride him that day. She just let him wear the saddle for a while and then took it off and stood with him, and Cricket put his nose against her shoulder and breathed, and it was one of the finest moments she had experienced in her professional life and possibly in any other category of life as well. "Tomorrow," she told Joseph. "Maybe tomorrow." It was tomorrow. She rode Cricket around the pen in the gold light of the early morning while the heat was still gentle and the air smelled of sage and dry earth. He walked and then trotted and then, because she asked and he chose to answer, he moved into a smooth canter that covered the ground with an ease and power that told her exactly why Joseph had called him the best horse he had ever owned. She brought him to a stop at the gate and found Joseph there with the particular expression of a man who has been given something back that he had accepted losing. She dismounted and stepped toward him through the gate, and he did something that neither of them had planned and that therefore had the best kind of spontaneity. He put his arms around her briefly but completely, his forehead dropping to the top of her head, and she allowed herself the luxury of leaning into it for just a moment, her hands against his chest. "Thank you," he said, in a voice that was not entirely steady. "Thank you for trusting me with him," she said. They stepped back from each other and looked at Cricket, who was standing at the gate watching them with the philosophical expression of a horse who is not surprised by human behavior. "I want to take him out," Joseph said. "Today, can I?" "Today," she said. "Yes." She watched him ride Cricket out of the pen and across the yard and through the gate into the open range beyond, and the horse moved under him with the gathering, willing movement of an animal that has remembered itself. And Effie stood at the fence and watched until they were a small figure against the wide copper land, and she felt something so full in her chest that it required a deep breath to make room for it. Martha appeared at her elbow, a cup of coffee in each hand, and gave Effie one without comment. "That horse," Martha said, watching, "has been breaking that man's heart for 2 years." "I know," Effie said. "And you fixed it," Martha said. "Cricket fixed it," Effie said. "We both just met him where he was." Martha made a sound that was non-committal but warm and sipped her coffee. "How are you finding it here?" she asked, in a tone that was not asking about the job. "I'm finding it very well," Effie said, which was both an understatement and perfectly true. "He's a good man," Martha said. "He's been a good man for a long time without much reward for it. His father was exacting, and his father's expectations have sat on him harder than he lets on. He needs someone who can see him clearly." "I see him clearly," Effie said. "I know you do," Martha said. "That's why I'm telling you." That evening after supper, when Martha had gone to her room and the ranch had settled into its night sounds, Joseph came to the porch where Effie was sitting with a book open in her lap that she had not been reading. He sat beside her, closer than he usually sat, and for a while neither of them said anything, and the silence was comfortable and full rather than empty. "I rode him to the East Creek," he said, finally. "We went all the way out." He covered the ground like he shook his head. "Like he used to." "Before, he'll keep getting better," she said. "He's himself again. The better part takes care of itself once that part is back." "Effie," he said. "Yes. I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it honestly, which means you don't have to say yes, and your answer won't change the position or the arrangement here, and I want you to know that before I ask it." "All right," she said, setting the book aside. "Will you walk out with me, formally?" He paused, and she saw the slight vulnerability of him navigating the words. "As a man who is asking a woman to walk out with him, because he intends to ask her something more significant at some point in the future, and wants to be honest about the trajectory." She looked at him. "You're telling me the intention before asking for the first step." "I don't want you to walk out with me under false pretenses," he said. "It wouldn't be fair. You deserve to know what direction this is headed if you agree to start down it." She was quiet for a moment, feeling the weight and the warmth of what he was offering, the complete transparency of it, the respect embedded in treating her as someone who deserved to know the whole truth of a situation before she agreed to enter it. "Yes," she said. "I'll walk out with you, and I appreciate knowing the direction." He exhaled slowly. "Good," he said. And then, because he was Joseph Walker and this was how he was, "I've been trying to find the right way to say that for about a week." "It came out very well," she said. The small smile she had been cataloging for weeks broke fully across his face, and in the lamplight from the window it was something to see. "Martha will say something," he warned. "Martha already knows," Effie said. He stared at her. "She told you." "She told me you were a good man who needed someone to see him clearly," Effie said. "I told her I could see you clearly." He looked away toward the night yard, and she thought she could see color in his face even in the lamp and starlight. And the fact that a 32-year-old man who had built and run a cattle ranch could still color slightly was a piece of information she found deeply and uselessly delightful. "She is entirely too perceptive for anyone's comfort," he said. "She's protecting you," Effie said. "The way people do when they love someone." "I know," he said. "I've known her since I was 12 years old." He paused. "My father hired her the year my mother died. She kept the household running and she kept me together, a lot of times. She pretended not to, which is what made it possible." Effie thought about the particular grace of someone offering their help wrapped in the dignity of your own independence, and felt a fresh appreciation for Martha Gaines. They sat together on the porch for another hour, talking and not talking, and the night was warm and full of sound. And Effie thought that this was what home felt like, this particular combination of place and people, and the quality of quiet that exists between people who trust each other. The county fair in September brought the Walker Ranch into Caldera Flats in force, with Ghost and the bay gelding entered in the exhibition and Cricket, ridden by Joseph himself in the working cattle demonstration, and Effie wearing her clean canvas skirt and the boots that fit, which she had purchased from the general store with her second month's pay. Ghost was magnificent. She worked him in the exhibition ring while half the county watched, and he performed everything she asked of him with a willingness and grace that made even the most skeptical face in the crowd go quiet and attentive. She could hear the change in the audience, the murmur that shifts into silence when something genuinely impressive is happening, and she did not perform for them but simply did the work, and the work was impressive enough on its own. Harlan Cross was there with several of his men. She saw him across the fairground in the early afternoon, and he looked at her and at Ghost, and at the crowd around the exhibition ring, and his expression was the particular one of a man revising an assessment he had made publicly enough that the revision costs him something. She did not go out of her way toward him, and she did not go out of her way to avoid him either. Cricket in the working cattle demonstration was something that made the crowd come to full attention. Joseph rode him with the ease of a man who has ridden a particular horse so long that the two of them share a language, and Cricket moved through the cattle with the intelligence and instinct that had made him valuable in the first place, cutting and turning with precision, his dark coat bright in the September sun. When it was over, Joseph rode Cricket through the gate and straight to where Effie was standing, and he looked down at her from the saddle with an expression that was uncomplicated and full. "He's back," Joseph said. "He's back," she agreed. He swung down from the saddle and landed beside her, and Cricket put his nose against Effie's shoulder the way he had taken to doing, and Joseph stood very close to her and said, quietly for only her, "I haven't been as glad of anything in a long time as I am of the fact that you rode into my gate." "You laughed at me," she pointed out. "I did," he said. "I am not proud of it." "I'm not sure I mind it any more," she said. "As an origin story, it's not without its charm." He laughed, the real laugh, and she felt it in her chest and let herself feel it without trying to account for it. Cord Hensley appeared at their side with 2 glasses of lemonade from the fair refreshments table, presented with the expression of a man who is performing a service for obvious reasons of his own amusement, and they took the glasses and he disappeared again with great tactical speed. "Everyone on this ranch is conspiring against my dignity," Joseph observed. "You have excellent people," she said. "I do," he said, looking at her. She sipped her lemonade. He sipped his. The fair went on around them with all of its sounds and dust and life. The matter of Harlan Cross and the water rights resolved itself about 3 weeks after the fair, not through confrontation, but through the county land office's verification of the existing deed, which confirmed that Joseph's grandfather had secured the water rights in question in 1851, and the documentation was entirely clear. Joseph presented this to Cord and Pete and Effie at the kitchen table one evening with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had known the truth of a thing and waited for the official record to catch up with what he knew. "That should settle it," Cord said. "Harlan will find something else to fuss about," Pete said philosophically, which was the most words Pete had spoken on any subject in a single sitting. "He usually does," Joseph said, "but this particular thing is settled." He caught Effie's eye across the table, and she read in his expression the particular relief that comes when a background worry that you have been carrying without fully acknowledging is finally set down. She felt the reflection of that relief in herself, and was vaguely surprised to find how much she had taken on, without deciding to, the concerns of this ranch and this man as her own. October came with the first cold fronts from the north, the wind carrying the specific sharpness of the change of season, and the hills around the valley shifted toward the colors of rust and amber and the dry gold of late grass. The work shifted, too, toward the preparations for winter, the laying in of feed and supplies, the checking and double-checking of structures against the coming cold. The horses Effie had worked were all established now in their new, better ways of being. Ghost was a working ranch horse, reliable and willing, ridden by Davy, who had taken to him immediately and treated him with the consideration that a young man with good instincts and someone to model them on can produce. The sorrel mare was sound and steady, Not perfect. She still disliked loud, unexpected noises more than most horses, but functional and increasingly confident. The bay gelding had turned out to be one of the most dependable horses on the property. And Cricket was himself again, not the self that had retreated during his long lameness, but something perhaps better, a self that had come back through difficulty and was therefore more settled than before. He and Joseph had the relationship of horse and rider that runs so deep it is almost a conversation, wordless and complete. On a Thursday evening in the first week of October, Joseph asked Effie to walk with him. They walked out past the barn and through the gate and into the open land that lay south of the main buildings, the land that in the low autumn sun was all copper and shadow, and the long horizontal light of late afternoon. They walked without hurrying, in a companionable silence that was by now one of her favorite places to exist. He stopped at a place where the land dropped slightly and opened a view across the whole southern portion of the valley, the creek catching the light in the middle distance, the hills curving in their protective arc around the edges. "My mother's grave is there," he said, gesturing toward a small rise with 3 trees on it, cottonwoods whose leaves had gone entirely golden. "My father is there too now, and my grandfather, 3 generations of people who made this place." She stood beside him and looked at the rise and the trees and the golden leaves moving in the thin wind. "It's a beautiful place to rest," she said. "It is," he said. "I've thought about it, about the fact that I'll be there too eventually, what it means for the ranch, for who carries it forward." He turned toward her and she turned toward him, and his face was entirely serious and entirely open. "I've been trying to think about how to do this properly," he said. "And I don't think there's a proper way for me because," he paused, "I'm not a man who performs things well. I say what I mean and I mean what I say, and that'll have to be enough." "It's always been enough," she said. "Effie," he said, "I love you. I have been in love with you since somewhere around the second week of your being here, and I suspect it was actually sooner than that, and I was simply slow to recognize it for what it was because I wasn't prepared for it." He paused. "I would like to marry you if you'll have me. I would like to build something with you, this ranch and a life and whatever comes from a life. And I want you to know that I am asking not because I need someone to stay and help run this place, though I do, but because you are the specific person that I want beside me. And if you said yes and then decided you didn't want to work with horses anymore, I would be happy to find another arrangement, because it's you I want, not the particular skills." She felt the declaration land in her with the weight of something real, not the performed weight of dramatic words, but the actual weight of truth said plainly by a person who means it. "I love you," she said, and her voice was clear and unhurried. "I've been in love with you since somewhere around the time Cricket followed me, and I looked up and saw your face, and understood that what was happening with that horse was not a separate thing from what was happening with me and you." She paused. "I will marry you, Joseph Walker, with great willingness and no reservations." He looked at her for a moment, and then he reached out and took her hand in his, and the feeling of his hand around hers in the autumn light with the valley spread golden and wide around them was something she knew she would carry for the rest of her life. "I do have a ring," he said, with a slight self-consciousness. "It was my mother's. Martha has been keeping it. I wasn't sure when to go get the ring," she said. He laughed, and it was the best version of his laugh, unconstrained and genuine, and he held her hand for another moment before they turned back toward the house together, walking the way 2 people walk when they have just agreed on a direction, and everything ahead of them is open and possible. Martha received the news with the expression of a woman who is delighted but not remotely surprised. She produced the ring from her apron pocket, which meant she had been carrying it, and this fact caused Joseph to stop and look at her with an expression of absolute betrayal. "How long have you had that in your pocket?" he asked. "Since this morning when you told me you were taking Effie for a walk this afternoon," Martha said, with complete serenity. Cord Hensley, who had been in the kitchen ostensibly looking for something in the pantry, made a choking sound and retreated with great speed. Davy, visible through the kitchen window in the yard, appeared to be trying not to exist loudly. The ring was a simple gold band with a small oval of deep blue stone, turquoise, set with modest silver work around it. It fit Effie's hand as if it had been waiting for it. "It suits you," Joseph said. My mother was a woman who wore things that suited the place she was in. She didn't like things that were impractical." "Then it was chosen for the right reason," Effie said. "And it's beautiful." He kissed her then for the first time, and it was quiet and warm and entirely itself, without performance, and she kissed him back, and Martha made a sound in the background that was tactfully neither present nor absent, and the kitchen of the Walker Ranch house felt full in the way that rooms feel when something important is happening in them. They were married in December of 1882 in the town of Caldera Flats, with Judge Albright presiding because the circuit preacher was not due until February, and Joseph had expressed no particular inclination to wait that long. Martha stood with Effie. Cord stood with Joseph. Roberto and Davy and Pete and Frank were all there, scrubbed and respectful. Dawes from the general store was there. Even 3 neighbors from nearby ranches came, word having gotten around in the way of small places. Harlan Cross was not there, which suited everyone. Clara, Joseph's sister, had written a long, warm letter that arrived 2 weeks before the wedding and that Effie read twice and kept. Clara said she was sorry she couldn't make the journey from Tucson, but that she had been watching from the letters Joseph wrote, and that she had not heard her brother sound the way he sounded in those letters since before their father's death, and that Effie must be something very good for that to be true. "She's right," Joseph said, when Effie told him about the letter. "I wrote her better letters after you came." The wedding ceremony was short and honest, and the weather, which could have been brutal in December in New Mexico, was instead clear and cold and sparkling. Effie wore her best dress, a dark blue wool that Martha had helped her alter so that it sat properly, and she had her hair dressed in the way she never usually bothered with it. And when Joseph saw her come toward him in the front of the judge's office, he stopped for just a moment with an expression that was worth the entire effort. The vows were spoken and meant in equal measure, and when the judge pronounced them married, Joseph took her hand in both of his and looked at her the way he had always looked at her, with that quality of full attention that made her feel entirely real and entirely seen. That winter they settled into the life of the ranch together, the deep domestic intimacy of 2 people learning to share a space and a routine, and all of the small negotiations of daily life. She was not a woman who found this diminishment. She found it expansion, the particular expansion that comes from having chosen something rather than having it assigned to you, from being someone's partner rather than someone's accessory. She continued with the horses through the winter, a new set of young horses that needed starting, and Joseph helped when she wanted him to, learning from her the things she had to teach and teaching her in return the aspects of the cattle operation that she had not been involved in before. They made a fluent partnership, complementary rather than identical, and the ranch ran better for it. In the spring of 1883, when the hills were greening up for the brief, brilliant season before the heat reasserted itself, Effie knew she was expecting a child. She told Joseph on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with their coffee while Martha was at church, and his face went through something she had never seen before, a kind of staggered joy, like a man who has been given something so much larger than he expected that his first reaction is simple, physical surprise. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers and said nothing for a long moment, and when he did speak his voice was not entirely steady. "Are you well?" he said. Everything is all right." "Everything is all right," she said. "I'm healthy. I'll be careful with the horses." "I'm not asking about the horses," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm telling you so you don't worry." He looked at her with the full quality of his attention, all of it, and said, "I'm going to worry. I'm going to worry about you for the rest of my life. That's the arrangement." "All right," she said. "Worry quietly and I'll tolerate it." He turned her hand over and pressed his lips to her palm, and she sat with the warmth of that against her skin, and felt the morning and the spring outside the window and the life of this place around her. And it was full. Every direction she looked it was full. Martha came back from church and was told and sat down hard in her chair, and cried briefly in a way that she would later describe as not crying at all but merely having something in her eye. And then she recovered and began immediately planning the practical accommodations that a child would require, which was the most characteristic thing she could possibly have done. The pregnancy moved through the spring and into the summer, and Effie worked through it, adapting as she needed to, stepping back from the most physical aspects of horse training and focusing on the evaluation and planning work that required her eye and her judgment, and not her body in close proximity to an unpredictable animal. Joseph accepted this adaptation without fuss and without the overprotective hovering that she had braced herself for, and she loved him freshly for that, for trusting her to know what she could and couldn't do. She wrote to Clara in Tucson, and Clara wrote back with warmth and detail, and the easy intimacy of a woman who is becoming a friend across the distance, and the correspondence became a regular thing, pages of news and opinion, and the particular confidences that exist between women who trust each other. In October of 1883, on a clear, cool night when the stars were very bright and the fire in the bedroom was adequate, Effie delivered a son. The birth was attended by the doctor from Caldera Flats, a competent, kind man named Dr. Henshaw, and by Martha, who proved to be someone whose competence in moments of genuine need was so absolute that it inspired a confidence that carried its own comfort. Joseph waited in the hallway with the particular suffering of men who are not permitted to do anything useful, and when Dr. Henshaw opened the door and said, "You have a son, Mr. Walker," he walked into the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Effie holding the child, and the expression on his face was one she would return to in her memory for the rest of her life. "He's very small," Joseph said, reaching out to touch the baby's hand with one careful finger. "He's perfectly the right size," she said. The baby, after deliberation of several days, was named Thomas James Walker. Thomas for Joseph's grandfather, the one who had built the first structures on this land. James for no particular reason except that when Effie said it and then said Walker together, something in it sounded right and settled and entire. Thomas was, from the first, a child of considerable opinion. He communicated his preferences with a directness and volume that suggested he had inherited something specific from at least one parent. He also, from very early on, showed an absolute fascination with horses, or rather with the sounds and smells and presences of horses, perking to attention whenever he heard hooves or the particular barn scent that came in on clothing. "Of course," Joseph said, watching Thomas crane toward the window from which the horse pen was visible when he was not yet 4 months old. "Of course." "Is that a complaint?" Effie asked. "It's an observation with great personal fondness," he said. Life on the Walker Ranch moved forward with the momentum of something that has found its proper shape and is proceeding in it. The cattle operation expanded modestly in 1884. A well-considered expansion rather than an ambitious one, Joseph being a man who preferred what was sustainable to what was dramatic. Effie's reputation with horses had, by this point, spread enough that people from neighboring counties wrote to ask if she would evaluate or start horses for them, and this led to a small but real additional enterprise, people bringing horses to the Walker Ranch and paying for Effie's time with them. Joseph handled this new dimension with the same equanimity he handled everything, making practical arrangements for the additional horses and their owners' visits, finding it not threatening but complimentary. "It's yours," he said when she raised the question of how the income from it should be handled. "The skill is yours, the enterprise is yours. It's on your land," she said. "Our land," he said, "which makes it ours. But the income from your skill should be yours. You can decide what to do with it." She decided to invest most of it back into horses, into acquiring and starting young horses that she then sold trained to buyers who wanted an animal they could work with rather than one they needed to fight. It was a satisfying circuit, the horses coming in frightened or uncertain and leaving capable and trusted, carrying something better than they had arrived with. Roberto, whose knowledge of the land and animals had never quite received its full recognition, became a genuine partner in evaluating the incoming horses. His eye for confirmation, and his practical knowledge of what made an animal suited for specific work proving invaluable. Effie advocated for raising his pay and his formal standing on the ranch, and Joseph agreed without argument, and the conversation they had about the broader injustice of it, the way a man whose family had worked this land for generations before the American government's claim on it was still required to prove his value to newcomers over and over, was one that they both took seriously, and that neither of them had fully satisfactory answers to, but which they resolved to navigate with as much fairness as they could within the constraints of the time they lived in. "It's not enough," she said, after one such conversation. "No," Joseph agreed, "but it's what we can do and we'll keep doing it." Roberto, for his part, seemed to value the frank acknowledgement as much as the practical improvement, and the working relationship between the four of them, Joseph and Effie and Roberto and Cord, who had settled into his role as a kind of senior ranch voice, was one of the genuine operational successes of the Walker Ranch in those years. Thomas took his first steps in the spring of 1884, which was also the spring that Ghost, the gray horse who had been the first, developed the confidence and training to be used in extended cattle work, a fulfillment of what Effie had seen in him from the beginning. He became, over the following years, one of the best horses on the property, a fact that Davy, who had loved him from the beginning, took as a personal vindication. Clara came to visit in the summer of 1884, making the journey from Tucson with her husband Raymond, a quiet, steady man who built furniture and had the particular contentment of someone whose life fits him well. Clara was dark-haired and bright-eyed, and moved through the world with the purposeful energy of someone who finds it interesting, and she and Effie took to each other with the immediate recognition of kindred natures. They spent 3 weeks together, long enough for Clara to sit in on the horse training and ask 100 well-phrased questions, and to hold Thomas on her lap while he slept, and to sit with Joseph in the evenings in the way of people who love each other and have not been in the same place for too long. Effie watched Joseph with his sister and felt the completeness of his family, this addition of Clara and Raymond extending the life of the ranch into something larger, more connected. And she felt herself as part of that family in a way that had no asterisk or qualification, fully belonging in the way she had not belonged to any family since she was a girl. "He's different," Clara said to Effie privately on the second-to-last evening of the visit, sitting on the porch while the men were inside looking at something Raymond had to show Joseph in the way of a new joinery technique that he had been perfecting. "Joseph, he's different from how he was before you came." "How so?" Effie asked. "He's lighter," Clara said. "He carries things, Joseph. He always has. He carries the ranch and the land and what my father wanted and what he thinks he owes to everyone around him. And he still carries all of that, I can see it, but he carries it differently now, like it's a load he's chosen rather than one he was given." Effie thought about this, about the way choosing something transforms the nature of what you carry. "He makes me feel the same way," she said, "like the things I carry are chosen, not just accumulated." Clara looked at her with the look of someone who has been watching carefully and approves thoroughly of what they see. "Good," she said. "You're good for each other. I wasn't sure he'd find it, and I worried about him out here, alone with the responsibility of it." "He's not alone now," Effie said. "No," Clara said, "he's not." Thomas grew with the ranch, the way children do in places where the land is wide and the work is real, with a solidity and a practicality and an unassailable confidence in the natural world. He could, by the time he was 4, identify horses by their gait and knew which ones would come to a held-out hand and which ones needed to be approached from the left. He spent hours in the barn with an equanimity about the size and power of horses that was entirely natural rather than trained, as if the scale of the animals was simply a fact of his world without threat. Joseph taught him the land. Effie taught him the horses, or rather she created the conditions for him to learn the horses in the way that she had learned them, through observation and patience, and the willingness to listen more than he acted. Martha, who had been 60 at the time of the wedding and moved more slowly now, remained the organizing force of the household, relinquishing small areas of domestic territory to Effie with the magnanimity of someone who is choosing generosity rather than being displaced. She and Effie had built the kind of relationship that works because both parties are honest about what they need and respectful of the other's need in return. Martha needed to be useful and necessary and to have her knowledge valued. Effie needed a household ally who understood Joseph Walker with the depth of someone who had known him from boyhood. They met each other's needs without calculation and without drama, and were therefore genuinely fond of each other. In 1886, when Thomas was 2.5 and had just distinguished himself by walking calmly up to Cricket and placing one small hand on the horse's nose while Effie held her breath nearby, Effie found herself expecting again. She told Joseph in the same kitchen where she had told him the first time, and his response was the same beautiful, staggered joy, less surprised this time but no less genuine. The second child, born in the winter of 1886, was a boy as well. They named him Daniel Robert Walker, Robert for Roberto, who had become in the years since enough of a pillar of the ranch and of the family's life that the honor was the minimum available acknowledgement. And Roberto, upon being told, pressed his lips together and looked away at the hills for a moment before speaking. And when he spoke, it was only to say that it was a good name for a strong boy, which was absolutely true. Thomas received his brother with the fair-minded interest of a child who is curious about new things. He regarded Daniel in the first days with the assessment of someone deciding what category of thing he was looking at, and then apparently concluded that he was interesting enough to merit attention, and appointed himself an unofficial supervisor of Daniel's development from that point forward. The ranch and the family and the life filled itself out in those years with the richness of things that are tended to, the way a garden that is watered and considered and given good ground produces more than you planted. By the late 1880s, the Walker Ranch was one of the better regarded operations in that part of New Mexico territory, not the largest and not the loudest, but sound, the kind of place that people in the surrounding communities thought of when they thought of how things ought to be done. The horses Effie had built her small enterprise around were known across several counties as exceptional, animals that had been started right and kept right, and were worth what was paid for them. She was 30 years old in 1888, Joseph 38, and they had accumulated between them a life of such specific satisfaction that she sometimes stood at the edge of a day and felt the fullness of it like a physical thing. She stood there one morning in the early autumn of 1888 with Thomas, who was 4.5 and had the earnest, observant energy of a child who is always storing information for later use, beside her at the fence, watching Joseph ride Cricket across the south end of the property. Cricket was 11 years old now, and had, in the years since his recovery, become the horse that Joseph would have told you was the one most completely matched to his particular self. They rode together with a mutual understanding that was close to wordless, and watching them from a distance was like watching something that had been built specifically for the two of them and could not have been otherwise. "Papa is good," Thomas said, with the critical satisfaction of someone whose evaluation carries weight. "He is," Effie agreed. "Is Cricket old?" Thomas asked, the particular logic of a 4-year-old tracking time. "For a horse," she said, "but he's healthy. He's got good years left." "Good," Thomas said, and returned to watching with his arms folded on the fence rail in unconscious mimicry of his father's habitual posture there. And the sight of it caught Effie somewhere soft, and she had to look at the horizon for a moment and breathe. Joseph rode back across the yard and came to where they stood, and Cricket stopped at the fence, and Thomas, with the fearlessness of a child who has grown up with these animals, reached up and put his hand on Cricket's nose, and Cricket bent his head and accepted it with the patience of a horse who understands small children. "Anything need doing this morning?" Joseph asked Effie, meaning, "I'm at your disposal," which was the practical language of their partnership. "I've got 2 horses arriving this afternoon," she said. "A man from Lincoln County. I'll want your eye on one of them, the gray he described in his letter. From the description, I think he might have a soundness issue that the owner hasn't identified yet, and I'd rather have you confirm what I see before I tell him." "I'll be here," he said. The morning was full, and the afternoon was full, and the evening settled in with the familiar sounds and warmth. And Martha made supper that required the whole table to be occupied, and Daniel, in his high chair, distributed sweet potato across a wider radius than should have been geometrically possible. And Thomas told a long and complicated story about something one of the barn cats had done that morning, with the narrative commitment of someone who believes his audience has unlimited time and interest. And Joseph caught Effie's eye across the table with the look of a man who finds his life, in this moment, exactly what he wants it to be. She caught his eye and returned the look, and between them passed something that had no words because it did not need any, the complete shared recognition of where they were and what they had made and what it was worth. Later that evening, when the children were in bed and Martha had retired and the ranch had quieted down to its night sounds, they sat on the porch together in the cooling October air, and the stars were the New Mexico stars, which are among the most serious stars available and make you feel the appropriate size and weight of yourself against the universe. "I've been thinking," Joseph said, which was how he often began when he had been considering something for longer than was immediately apparent. "About," she said. "About next spring," he said. "About starting the south pasture on the grass Roberto has been recommending, and about," he paused, "about building the extra stable, the one we've talked about, for the enterprise, proper stalls and a proper working space." She had drawn rough plans for the stable twice and folded them up both times because the expense felt large. "The timber would be expensive," she said. "I've been setting money aside," he said, "for a year. Without telling you, which I will acknowledge was probably not the most communicative thing I've done." She turned to look at him. "You've been saving for my stable." "For our stable," he said. "For the enterprise that is yours and that I happen to be invested in because it is you doing it." She was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted it to be something I could offer you completely without the condition of a future maybe," he said. "I wanted to be able to say, the money is there. The stable can be built. Not I hope to, not we'll see." She understood this about him, the preference for the solid over the promised, the discomfort with anything that resembled an empty gesture. He had been his father's son in many ways, but this trait was entirely his own. "All right," she said. "We'll build it." He nodded with the expression of a man who has been quietly planning something for 12 months and is genuinely pleased to see it move forward. "I have something to tell you as well," she said. He looked at her. "There will likely be a 3rd child," she said. "By summer, I think." The expression that moved across his face was the same as before and the same as before that, the staggered, genuine joy that had not diminished with repetition, but if anything had deepened, the way a well gets deeper when you keep going back to it. "Are you well?" he said, because this was always the first thing he said. "I'm very well," she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his shoulder, and they sat with the stars above them and the dark land all around, and the sounds of the ranch in the night. And she felt the profound, specific contentment of a life that is exactly where it is supposed to be. The stable was built in the spring of 1889, a fine structure of good timber that Roberto oversaw with the precision of a man who has been waiting to do something properly for years. It had 6 proper stalls and a wide central aisle, an attack room, and a separate area for working with the incoming horses that had everything Effie had sketched out in those folded plans: a solid fence, good light, space enough to move and to work, and to let a horse understand that it was safe. The third child arrived in June of 1889, when the summer was settling in and the new stable smelled of fresh wood and hay. It was a girl this time, dark-eyed and decided, who arrived with an efficiency that Dr. Henshaw described as businesslike, and that Martha described as characteristic of someone who knows what she wants. She was named Eleanor Claire Walker, Eleanor being a name that had run on Effie's mother's side of the family before everything changed, a tether to a past that deserved better than to be entirely let go. Claire for Clara, who was notified by post and wrote back a letter of 8 pages that arrived in mid-July, and that Effie read aloud to Joseph on the porch one evening in the warm summer night, and they both laughed in several places and felt the warmth of being loved from a distance. Thomas received his sister with the judicious assessment he applied to all new information, and concluded, after approximately 48 hours, that she was acceptable and that he would take responsibility for certain aspects of her education. Daniel, who was 2.5, received her with the absoluteness of a child, who takes the existence of new people as simply factual, and who was observed attempting to share with her a piece of sweet potato that she was not developmentally equipped to eat, in a gesture of generosity that required gentle management. Cricket lived to 15, which was a good long life for a working horse, and he went in the autumn of 1893 on a clear blue day, quietly, without distress, in the way that sometimes happens when an animal has been well cared for and loved. Joseph buried him under the cottonwoods on the rise with the family graves, which was not the conventional thing, but was the right thing for Cricket, and Effie stood beside Joseph at the grave and held his hand and said nothing because nothing was needed. He was quiet for several days, and she let him be quiet and stayed close, and when he came out of it the way people do when they have let themselves fully feel something rather than pushing it down, with a wholeness that had not been diminished by the loss. Ghost became the horse Thomas chose as his own, inheriting him with the same conscious devotion with which Davy had loved him through his younger years. Ghost was 14 and still sound and deeply reliable, and Thomas, who was 9 by then and riding with a competence that was clearly genetic, took to Ghost the way you take to something that was always meant for you. Life continued to accumulate its details and its moments, the seasons of the ranch each distinct, the springs with their brief vivid color, and the summer heat that settled on the valley like a patient presence, and the autumn with its copper hills, and the winters that were mild enough most years to work through, and harsh enough some years to make you grateful for solid walls and well-made roofs. Roberto married a woman named Soledad in the early 1890s, and the wedding was on the Walker Ranch by invitation and attended by everyone. And Soledad was small and serious and competent in several directions, and she and Effie understood each other from the first hour of knowing each other, the understanding of 2 women who have built their capabilities without being given anything particular with which to build them. Cord Hensley, who had been a bachelor for the entirety of Effie's time on the ranch and who seemed settled in this condition, surprised everyone considerably in 1892 by courting and marrying the schoolteacher in Caldera Flats, a woman named Agnes who wore spectacles and had opinions about everything, and who brought into Cord's life a level of intellectual engagement he had not previously known he required, and visibly thrived on once he had it. Davy, the young one with the sunburned neck from that first morning, stayed on at the Walker Ranch long enough to become a very capable horseman himself, and then moved on in the late 1880s to a larger operation up north where he could advance more quickly, departing with everyone's genuine goodwill and a horse, the bay gelding, which Joseph gave him outright as a farewell. The Walker Ranch passed into the new decade of the 1890s with the stability of something that has been built properly, not without difficulty, not without the various losses and adjustments that any life contains, but with the fundamental soundness of a thing that is where it is supposed to be. Eleanor, who had arrived as a businesslike infant, grew into a child of enormous curiosity and comprehensive stubbornness, who could, by the time she was 4, outnegotiate Thomas on most subjects, and had identified horses as her particular interest with a single-mindedness that suggested the thing was hereditary. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's directness, and a quality of attention that was entirely her own, the focused, patient observation of someone who intends to understand whatever she is looking at completely before she acts on that understanding. Effie watched her daughter with the specific recognition of seeing your own nature in someone else's face, and felt the particular joy and responsibility of that. Thomas at 10 was becoming a young man of the kind the West produced when things went well, capable and honest, and genuinely good at the things that mattered, good with animals and with people, and with the land, carrying on the knowledge that his parents had built and adding to it his own. Daniel at 7 was quieter and more inward than his siblings, a boy who listened long before he spoke, and who, when he spoke, often said things that the people around him had been thinking without quite finding the words for. He showed the earliest interest in the accounting and record-keeping side of the ranch operation, which Joseph recognized and encouraged, and by the time he was old enough to formally be taught mathematics, he already had an intuitive grasp of the relationship between numbers that suggested he would take the ranch's bookkeeping to a level of management it had not previously achieved. In 1895, Joseph turned 45, and Effie was 37, and they marked this in the way they had learned to mark things, not with great production but with the particular attention that says, "This matters and we know it." They rode out together on a Saturday afternoon, Joseph on a new horse he had been working with alongside Effie, and that was beginning to give him the same quality of communication that Cricket had, and Effie on the sorrel mare who had come through her fear, and was now 12 years old and the most trusted horse in Effie's string. They rode south to the creek and watered the horses and sat on the bank in the afternoon light, and the 13 years of their life together were present in the way that time becomes present when you are in a place that has accumulated it. "I'm glad I rode through that gate," she said. He looked at her with the full, dark quality of his attention, exactly as he always had. "I'm glad you wrote that letter," he said, "even if you deliberately failed to specify." "Especially because I deliberately failed to specify," she said. He smiled, the one she had been cataloging since the first week and had never finished cataloging because there were always new versions of it that she had not previously seen. "You would have gotten the position regardless," he said. "The moment you walked into that pen and that horse moved toward you, you had the position." "You laughed at me first," she said. "I did," he said. "And then, by noon, I was asking you to stay." "More or less," she said. "More rather than less," he said. "I didn't know at noon that I was asking you to stay, but I was." He paused. "Everything I said to you about the position was about the position, and underneath everything I said about the position was, 'Please stay.'" She sat with that with the long, retroactive clarity of knowing the beginning of a thing from its middle and its far end. "I heard it," she said. "Under the words about the position, I heard it." "I know you did," he said. "That's why you stayed." The creek moved past them in the good, steady way of water that knows where it is going, and the afternoon light lay on the hills in sheets of amber, and the horses grazed a few feet away with perfect equanimity. And the world around them was the world they had made, particular and full and worth every single thing that had gone into it. She put her hand over his on the grass between them, and he turned his hand up to hold it properly, and they sat together in the afternoon in the wide open silence of the New Mexico territory. This woman who had ridden in on a borrowed horse with a letter of introduction and a particular skill, and 6 years of unsettledness looking for a place worth stopping, and this man who had laughed and then listened and then seen. And what they had built together in the 13 years between that first morning and this afternoon was everything a life is supposed to be, and then some. Thomas was learning to start young horses under Effie's supervision that summer. Alina had begun insisting on being present for these sessions, sitting on the fence with her legs dangling, and her dark eyes following every movement with the focused patience of someone for whom this was not entertainment but information. Daniel had filled 4 pages of a new ledger book with a system of his own invention for tracking the horse's arrival dates and progress that was so logical and well organized that Effie had looked at it, and then at her 7-year-old son and said, with complete sincerity, "Where did you learn to do that?" "I just made it," Daniel said, with the shrug of someone who does not understand why this would be remarkable. Martha, who was now past 70 and moved with the deliberateness of a woman who has earned every one of her years, was still the organizing intelligence of the household, still the one who knew where everything was and what needed doing before the need was apparent, though she now had help from a young woman named Cecilia from town who came 3 days a week, and whom Martha was training with the thoroughness of someone building something intended to outlast them. Roberto and Soledad had 2 children of their own, a boy named Miguel and a girl named Ana, and the 2 families moved between their households with the comfortable frequency of people whose lives are legitimately intertwined rather than merely adjacent, the children growing up together with the knowledge of each other that lasts. The country was changing around them, the territory moving toward the statehood that would come eventually, the railroad having reached further and further into the territory, and bringing with it the changes that railroads always bring, faster connection and faster commerce, and the particular kind of disruption that comes with faster everything. But out in the valley ringed by copper hills, the pace of things remained tied to the land and the seasons and the animals, as it had always been, and the life there had a coherence and a depth that faster things often lack. On an evening in the autumn of 1895, with the last of the day's light turning the hills their deepest copper and the air carrying the particular clarity of a high desert fall, Effie stood at the fence of the new stable and watched Alina on the fence across from her, watching a young horse in the pen below, and Alina's face had the quality of attention that Effie recognized from the inside because she had worn it her whole life. The look of someone listening for what the horse is actually saying rather than imposing what they expect to hear. The horse in the pen was a 4-year-old bay mare, recently arrived, nervous and quick and full of unexamined potential. Alina was watching her the way you watch something that has not yet become what it is going to be, with the patience of someone willing to wait for it. Joseph came to stand beside Effie at the fence, and they watched Alina watch the horse in the slow-moving autumn light, and neither of them said anything because the thing they were looking at did not require commentary. What was present in that moment was a continuity, not just of land and structure and the practical operations of a ranch, but of a way of understanding things, of meeting animals and people and the world itself with a particular quality of honest attention that asks what something is rather than what you need it to be, and that hands that understanding forward rather than hoarding it. Joseph's hand found hers on the fence rail and held it, and she held his back, and across the pen Alina said something quiet to the bay mare, and the mare's ears came forward. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked since the beginning, since the first morning when a woman had walked into a pen and stood still enough that a frightened horse chose to walk toward her. You showed up consistently. You paid attention. You waited for the thing to come to you instead of chasing it into a corner. And if you were patient, and if you were honest, and if you were willing to be present in the full, open, unhurried way that trust requires, the thing you were waiting for came. It had come for her in the form of a ranch in a copper-hilled valley in New Mexico territory, and a man who had the good sense, once he stopped laughing, to see what he was actually looking at. She watched Alina and the bay mare and the evening light, and she felt the wholeness of it, all of it, from the borrowed horse and the ill-fitting boots and the letter that hadn't specified, all the way to this moment, Thomas in the barn, Daniel at his ledger book, Joseph's hand in hers, Martha inside at the stove, Roberto's voice somewhere in the distance, the sound of the ranch in the evening settling into its good familiar rhythms. This was the place worth stopping for. This was the thing worth staying for. She had known it since the morning a gray horse had chosen to walk toward her, and she had looked up through the fence and found dark eyes watching. And she had felt, under the professionalism of the assessment, under the practical question of the job and the position and the horses, something else entirely. Something that would take months to name and years to fully understand and a lifetime to inhabit properly. She inhabited it now completely in the fading light of an October evening in New Mexico Territory, 1895, with all of the evidence of her life arranged around her in the forms of people and horses and land and accumulated trust. And it was, in every direction she looked, exactly enough.